Before we begin this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss another amazing true story like this one. Now let's dive in. The morning sun cast golden streaks across the Pacific Ocean as Captain Sarah Mitchell stood on the deck of her modest fishing vessel, the Sea Whisper. The salty breeze tugged at her dark hair, which she had tied back in a simple ponytail. At 42 years old, Sarah looked like any other commercial fisher making an honest living from the sea. Her weathered hands gripped the railing as she watched the horizon, her keen eyes scanning the waters she had come to know so well over the past 3 years. Sarah had purchased the Sea Whisper with her savings after retiring from a career that most people would never believe. For 20 years, she had served in one of the most elite military units in the world, operating in shadows and silence. But those days were behind her now. She had chosen a quiet life, one where the only battles she fought were against rough seas and tangled fishing nets. The ocean had become her therapy, her escape from memories that still haunted her dreams. On this particular morning, Sarah was checking her crab pots about 15 miles off the California coast. The work was solitary and peaceful, exactly what she needed. She had just hauled up her third pot when she noticed a vessel approaching from the south. Through her binoculars, she could make out the distinctive orange and white markings of a Coast Guard cutter. Her stomach tightened slightly, though she had no reason to worry. Her paperwork was in order, her licenses current, and her vessel maintained 2 regulation standards. The Coast Guard cutter drew closer, and Sarah could see crew members on deck preparing to make contact. She set down her equipment and waited, hands resting casually on her hips. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker, commanding her to prepare for boarding and inspection. Sarah complied without hesitation, securing her deck and gathering her documentation from the small cabin below. As the Coast Guard team came aboard, Sarah immediately sensed something was off. The lead officer, a young lieutenant named Brennan, carried himself with an aggressive posture that seemed excessive for a routine inspection. His eyes swept over her vessel with suspicion that went beyond professional caution. Behind him, 3 other guardsmen fanned out across her deck, their hands never far from their sidearms. Lieutenant Brennan barely glanced at the documents Sarah offered. Instead, he began firing questions at her with an intensity that made it clear this was no ordinary stop. Where had she been for the past week? What was she really doing out here? Did she have any passengers aboard? His tone suggested he had already decided she was guilty of something. He just needed to figure out what. Sarah remained calm, answering each question truthfully and directly. She explained her fishing route, showed her catch logs, and offered full access to every part of her vessel. But Brennan seemed unsatisfied with her cooperation. He ordered his team to conduct a thorough search, emphasizing the word thorough in a way that made Sarah's jaw clench slightly. For the next hour, the Coast Guard team tore through her boat with alarming aggression. They opened every hatch, dumped out storage containers, and even began pulling up floorboards in the cabin. Sarah watched in growing frustration as they treated her home and livelihood like a crime scene. She had served her country with distinction, received medals she could never publicly display, and now she was being treated like a smuggler or a terrorist. When one of the guardsmen roughly shoved aside her fishing gear, sending expensive equipment clattering across the deck, Sarah's patience began to wear thin. She stepped forward to object, but Brennan immediately moved to block her path, his hand moving to his weapon in a gesture of intimidation. The message was clear. She was to stand aside and accept whatever treatment they deemed necessary. Lieutenant Brennan's suspicions seemed to center on the idea that Sarah's vessel was being used for illegal activities. He questioned her repeatedly about connections to drug trafficking operations, about unusual cargo, about secret compartments that might be hidden in the hull. His certainty that she was hiding something bordered on obsessive, and Sarah began to wonder what had triggered such intense scrutiny. She had been fishing these waters for 3 years without incident. What had changed? As the search dragged on with no findings, Brennan's frustration became evident. Conferred with his team in hushed tones, occasionally glancing back at Sarah with narrowed eyes. She could hear fragments of their conversation, mentions of reports, suspicious activity, someone matching her description. It slowly dawned on her that they had received some kind of tip or intelligence that had led them to her vessel. Finally, Brennan returned to face her directly. His expression had hardened into something beyond professional suspicion. He informed Sarah that based on their assessment, they had grounds to believe her vessel was being used for illegal purposes. The words hit her like a physical blow. He was going to seize her boat, impound it for further investigation, and she would be detained for questioning. Everything she had built in her new life was about to be stripped away based on nothing more than suspicion and some phantom report. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, felt the old training kicking in despite her best efforts to remain a civilian. She had faced enemy combatants, navigated impossible missions, and made life-or-death decisions in the space of seconds, upstanding. On the deck of her own boat, being treated like a criminal by the very country she had bled for, she felt a different kind of danger. This was a threat to her peace, to the quiet life she had carefully constructed away from violence and chaos. Lieutenant Brennan began making arrangements for a tow vessel, speaking into his radio with the confidence of someone certain in their authority. His team continued their search, now even more invasive, as they looked for any shred of evidence to justify the seizure. Sarah stood silently, her mind racing through options. She had hoped to never reveal her past, to leave that part of her life buried beneath the waves. But as she watched her world being dismantled before her eyes, she realized she might have no choice. Sarah took a deep breath, weighing her options carefully. She had spent 3 years building a barrier between her past and present. 3 years trying to be just another person living an ordinary life. The credentials she carried were not supposed to be used except in the most extreme circumstances. They were a lifeline she had hoped never to need. But as she watched Lieutenant Brennan coordinate the seizure of her vessel, she realized that moment had arrived. Reaching slowly into her jacket pocket, making sure her movements were visible and non-threatening, Sarah pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside was a card she had not looked at in over 2 years. The identification was unmarked to civilian eyes, but to anyone with the right clearance, it told a very different story about who she really was. She held it out toward Brennan without saying a word. The lieutenant glanced at the card dismissively, clearly expecting another fishing license or some civilian credential that meant nothing to his investigation. But as his eyes focused on what he was actually seeing, his expression changed dramatically. The color drained from his face, and his hand froze halfway to taking the card from her. He looked up at Sarah, then back at the card, then up again with something approaching shock. The identification showed Sarah's real clearance level, her service designation, and most importantly, contact number that connected directly to a very specific office within the Department of Defense. The card indicated she held credentials far above top secret, the kind that meant she had operated in realms most military personnel did not even know existed. Lieutenant Brennan's hands actually shook slightly as he finally took the card from her to examine it more closely. Sarah watched his reaction without expression. She could see him trying to reconcile the woman standing before him in fishing gear and rubber boots with the level of clearance indicated on the card. His team had stopped their search, noticing their commander's sudden change in demeanor. One of them started to ask what was wrong, but Brennan silenced him with a sharp gesture. Never taking his eyes off the identification, the young lieutenant's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. He asked if the credentials were current, if she was active or retired. Sarah informed him that while she was officially retired from active service, her clearance was permanent and her designation remained classified. The card authorized her to make contact with specific offices if circumstances required verification of her identity or background. She suggested he might want to use the number provided. Brennan looked like a man who had just realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his satellite phone and stepped away to the far side of the deck. Sarah could not hear his conversation, but she could see his body language shift from confident authority to something closer to panic. He kept glancing back at her as he spoke, his free hand running through his hair repeatedly, a gesture of stress and worry. The call lasted nearly 10 minutes. When Brennan returned, he looked like a completely different person. His aggressive posture had vanished, replaced by careful respect bordering on fear. He handed Sarah's credentials back to her with both hands, as if the card itself was something precious and dangerous. His voice cracked slightly as he apologized for the inconvenience and began ordering his team to stop their search immediately. But Sarah was not satisfied with a simple apology. She asked directly what intelligence had led them to her vessel, with such certainty that she was involved in criminal activity. She wanted to know who had flagged her, what information they had received, why a routine fishing vessel had warranted this level of aggressive investigation. Her tone remained calm, but there was steel beneath her words that made Brennan realize she expected answers. The lieutenant stammered through an explanation. They had received a report from an informant suggesting that a vessel matching the Sea Whisper's description was being used to run illegal goods up the coast. The informant had been reliable in the past, providing information that led to several successful interdictions. Based on that intelligence and Sarah's vessel matching the general description, they had been authorized to conduct a thorough inspection and seizure if warranted. Sarah processed this information with the analytical mind of someone trained to see patterns and connections. An informant with a track record of reliability does not randomly misidentify a vessel. Either someone had deliberately provided false information about her, or there was another boat out there matching her description that was actually involved in illegal activity. Neither explanation was comforting, but the first was particularly troubling. She asked Brennan if he could provide any specific details about what they were supposedly looking for. Drugs, weapons, people. The lieutenant hesitated, then admitted that the information had been vague, suggesting contraband of some kind, but not specifying exactly what. That vagueness now struck him as suspicious in light of who Sarah actually was. He seemed to be having the same realization she had already reached, that this might not have been an innocent case of mistaken identity. Sarah's mind was already working through possibilities. In her years of service, she had made enemies, not many, but the ones she had were dangerous and resourceful. She had also been involved in operations that disrupted criminal networks with international reach. It was possible that someone from that past had tracked her down, identified her new life, and decided to cause problems. A false tip to the Coast Guard would be a relatively simple way to disrupt her peace and potentially expose her location to others. Lieutenant Brennan continued apologizing, assuring her that they would file a report about the false intelligence, and that her vessel would not be flagged for any further scrutiny. His team had already begun hastily putting her equipment back in order, trying to undo the chaos of their search, but Sarah barely noticed their efforts. Her focus had shifted to a much larger concern than a disrupted fishing trip. She asked Brennan to do something for her. She wanted information about the informant who had provided the tip, not their name or identity, which she knew he could not provide, but any details about how the information had been delivered and what specific descriptors had been given about her vessel. The lieutenant looked uncertain, torn between wanting to help someone with her credentials and protecting the confidentiality of their intelligence sources. Sarah pressed the issue, explaining that if someone had deliberately targeted her with false information, it represented a potential security concern beyond just a fishing boat. Her past work had involved sensitive operations, and anyone trying to locate or harass her might have access to information or capabilities that posed broader risks. Brennan seemed to understand the implication. Someone was targeting a retired Special Forces operator. The Coast Guard might have unknowingly become part of a larger and more dangerous situation. The lieutenant promised to look into it, to see what details he could share without compromising their sources. He also offered to file an incident report that would go up his chain of command, flagging the situation as potentially involving targeted harassment of retired military personnel with sensitive backgrounds. Sarah accepted this, though she knew such official channels would move slowly and might not provide the answers she needed quickly enough. As the Coast Guard team prepared to leave her vessel, Sarah felt the weight of a decision settling over her. For 3 years, she had been just a fisher, anonymous and unremarkable. But that anonymity had apparently been an illusion. Someone knew who she was, where she was, and how to cause her trouble. The question now was whether she could handle this threat while maintaining her civilian life, or whether she would need to reach back into skills and contacts she had hoped to leave behind forever. The Coast Guard cutter disappeared over the horizon, leaving Sarah alone on the gently rocking deck of the Sea Whisper. The afternoon sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across her scattered equipment. She stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the water, her mind already shifting into a mode of thinking she had tried to leave behind. Threat assessment, pattern recognition, operational security review. Sarah began the task of properly securing her vessel and stowing her gear. But her hands moved on autopilot while her thoughts raced elsewhere. She mentally cataloged everyone who might have reason to track her down. The list was shorter than some might expect from 20 years of covert operations, but each name on it represented someone genuinely dangerous. People with resources, connections, and most importantly, motivation to settle old scores as she worked. Sarah's training reasserted itself despite her best efforts to remain a civilian. She found herself checking sight lines and exposure angles on her boat, identifying weak points in her daily routine, mentally mapping escape routes from her marina. It was like muscle memory, automatic and unwelcome. This was exactly what she had tried to escape by coming to the ocean, by choosing a life of simple labor and solitude. By the time she finished securing her vessel, Sarah had made a decision. She would not wait passively for whoever had targeted her to make another move. That had never been her approach during her service years, and falling into a defensive posture now would only give her unknown adversary more opportunities. She needed information, and she knew where to start looking. Sarah fired up the Sea Whisper's engine and began the journey back to port. The marina where she docked was a modest facility about an hour south of Monterey, small enough that most of the fishers knew each other, but busy enough that strangers did not stand out. As she navigated the coastal waters, she used her satellite phone to make a call she had been avoiding for 2 years. The voice that answered was gruff and familiar, belonging to Marcus Webb, a former colleague who had retired from active service 3 years before. Sarah Marcus had transitioned into private security consulting, which was a polite way of saying he helped other retired operators stay alive when their pasts caught up with them. He had reached out to Sarah twice after her retirement, offering assistance if she ever needed it. She had politely declined both times, insisting she was fine. Now she was calling him. Marcus listened without interrupting as Sarah explained the situation. The Coast Guard boarding, the suspiciously specific intelligence, the feeling that someone had deliberately sent authorities to her location. When she finished, there was a long pause before Marcus spoke. His response was not what she expected. He told her she was the third person from their old unit to report similar incidents in the past. For months, Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. 3 people from the same unit, all experiencing targeted harassment or suspicious official attention. That eliminated the possibility of random chance or personal vendettas. This was organized, coordinated, and specific to their former team. Marcus explained that the other 2 incidents had seemed isolated at the time. One operator had their financial accounts frozen due to a suspicious activity report. Another had been detained at an airport for hours based on a terrorism watch list flag that was later determined to be erroneous. The pattern Marcus described was sophisticated. Each incident was just barely plausible enough to seem like a mistake or bureaucratic error. Nothing overtly violent or illegal that would trigger a full investigation, but enough to disrupt lives, expose locations, and force retired operators to reveal themselves through official channels. Someone was methodically working through members of their old unit, testing responses, gathering information, building a picture of where everyone had ended up. Sarah asked the obvious question: who had that kind of capability and motivation? Their unit had been involved in countless operations across multiple continents, disrupting terrorist networks, criminal organizations, and hostile intelligence operations. The list of potential enemies was extensive. But Marcus had a theory. He believed someone was not seeking revenge, but rather hunting for something specific. Information or an asset that one of their team members possessed. The conversation shifted to operational details. Marcus had been quietly investigating the incidents, using contacts still active in various agencies to piece together information. He had traced some of the false intelligence back to a sophisticated disinformation network that operated across multiple countries. Whoever was behind this had resources that went beyond typical criminal organizations. They had access to intelligence databases, the ability to create convincing false reports, and patience to execute a long-term operation. Sarah asked about the other two operators who had been targeted. Were they safe? Marcus's pause before answering told her everything she needed to know. One had disappeared 2 weeks ago. No trace, no explanation. The other had gone dark voluntarily, recognizing the threat and using old skills to vanish completely. The implication was clear. People were not just being harassed, they were being hunted, and at least one person had likely already been caught. The conversation ended with Marcus insisting they meet in person. He had information he could not share over phone lines, even encrypted ones. He suggested a location in Nevada, neutral ground far from either of their current residences. Sarah agreed, already mentally planning her route and security protocols. She would not arrive unprepared or predictable. As the Sea Whisper approached the marina, Sarah scanned the docks with new eyes. Every vehicle in the parking lot became a potential surveillance post. Every person walking along the waterfront became a possible watcher. She hated this feeling, this return to constant vigilance and suspicion. For 3 years, she had enjoyed the simple act of walking into a grocery store without checking exits and blind spots. That peace was gone now, stripped away by whoever had decided to drag her back into the shadows. She docked her vessel with practiced efficiency, securing lines and shutting down systems while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. Several other fishers were working on their boats, familiar faces that waved greetings. Sarah returned the waves automatically, wondering if any of them had noticed anything unusual lately. Strangers asking questions, vehicles that did not belong, people taking too much interest in her schedule and movements. In her small cabin, Sarah opened a locker that had remained locked since she first purchased the boat. Inside was a waterproof case containing items from her previous life. A secondary identification under a different name. Several $1,000s in various currencies, contact information for people who could provide assistance outside official channels, and a handgun she had hoped never to carry again. A compact 9mm that had been with her through more situations than she cared to remember. Sarah packed a small bag with essentials, moving with the efficient speed of someone who had done this countless times before. She would leave tonight, tell the marina manager she was visiting family for a week, and make her way to Nevada using a route that would expose any surveillance. If someone was following her, she would know before she reached Marcus. And if they were foolish enough to try stopping her, they would discover that retirement had not dulled her skills as much as they might hope. Before leaving the boat, Sarah paused to look around the small space that had been her home and sanctuary. The worn cushions on the bunk, the tiny galley where she made coffee each morning, the book stacked beside her pillow. This life had been real, had been good. She felt anger rising at whoever had decided to take it from her, to drag her back into a world of violence and shadows. But beneath the anger was something else. A cold calculation that had kept her alive through 2 decades of impossible missions. If someone wanted to hunt her, they would find she was far more dangerous than they anticipated. The drive from California to Nevada took Sarah through landscapes that shifted from coastal beauty to stark desert expanses. She had chosen a route that wound through smaller highways and back roads, avoiding the predictable interstate corridors where surveillance would be easiest. The rental car she drove was unremarkable, paid for with cash using her alternate identification. She had left her truck in a long-term parking garage 3 towns away from her marina. Another layer of misdirection for anyone trying to track her movements. Every few hours, Sarah stopped at random locations to check if she was being followed. Gas stations, rest stops, small-town diners where she could observe traffic patterns and identify vehicles that appeared more than once. It was tedious work, requiring patience and attention to detail. But it was also fundamental to staying alive when people were hunting you. By the time she crossed into Nevada, she was confident she had arrived clean, with no tail. The meeting location Marcus had chosen was a small diner on the outskirts of a town that existed, primarily to service travelers heading to Las Vegas. It was the kind of place where people came and went without attracting attention, where faces were forgotten as soon as they left. Sarah arrived an hour before the scheduled meeting time. Parking where she had a clear view of the entrance and multiple exit routes, she watched the diner for 40 minutes before entering, observing patterns of traffic and identifying the handful of customers who were locals versus travelers. Marcus had taught her this patience years ago. During their first joint operation, in a country whose name was still classified, rush into a meeting and you might walk into a trap. Take your time, understand your environment, and you significantly increase your chances of walking out again. When Sarah finally entered the diner, she spotted Marcus immediately in a corner. Boothat offered good sightlines to both the entrance and the kitchen exit. He looked older than she remembered, his hair gone completely gray, and new lines etched deep around his eyes. But his posture was alert, and she noticed his hand resting casually near his waist, where she knew he would be carrying a weapon. They did not embrace or engage in warm greetings. Instead, Sarah slid into the booth across from him and ordered coffee from the waitress, who appeared with practiced efficiency. Only after the waitress had moved away did Marcus slide a thin folder across the table. Inside were photographs and documents that Sarah began reviewing immediately, her trained eye-catching details and making connections. The photos showed faces she recognized. Members of her old unit scattered across various surveillance images. Some were clearly professional quality, taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions. Others appeared to be pulled from security cameras or official databases. Beside each photo were notes detailing recent activities, current locations, and in some cases, dates and times of incidents similar to what Sarah had experienced. Marcus explained what he had learned. The pattern was more extensive than he had initially realized. At least 8 members of their 12-person unit had been targeted in some way over the past 6 months. The operations against them were sophisticated, using official channels whenever possible to apply pressure and gather information. Coast Guard boardings, airport detentions, financial audits, even a home invasion that was made to look like a random burglary, but was clearly a professional intelligence gathering operation. Sarah studied the timeline Marcus had constructed. The attacks had started slowly, one every few weeks, but had accelerated recently. Whoever was orchestrating this was gaining confidence and resources. More concerning was the geographic spread. Targets were scattered across the United States, and even internationally, yet the operations maintained a consistent signature. That level of coordination required significant funding and organizational capability. The question that haunted Sarah, as she reviewed the materials, was the same one Marcus had raised during their phone call. What were they looking for? The unit had been disbanded 4 years ago. Their operations officially concluded and documented in files that were sealed under the highest classification levels. If someone wanted intelligence about their past missions, there were far easier ways to obtain it than hunting down individual operators. Marcus had a theory, one he presented carefully while watching Sarah's reaction. During their final operation, the one that had led to the unit's dissolution, they had recovered something significant. Not weapons or documents, but digital intelligence that compromised dozens of networks operating across multiple countries. The data had been turned over to proper authorities, or so they had been told. But Marcus believed that some of the intelligence had been copied, kept as insurance by someone within their team. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she listened. She knew exactly which operation Marcus was referring to. It had been their most dangerous mission. Operating deep in territory controlled by a criminal network that dealt in everything from weapons to human trafficking, the intelligence they had seized from that operation had been staggering in scope, revealing connections between organized crime, corrupt officials, and even elements within various intelligence agencies. The official story was that all the data had been secured and analyzed by appropriate authorities. Arrests had been made, networks disrupted, and the operation classified as a major success. But Sarah remembered the chaos of their extraction, the rushed handling of digital storage devices, and the fact that they had been operating with minimal oversight in the field. If someone had decided to keep copies of that intelligence, it would not have been difficult to do so without detection. Marcus laid out his conclusion. Someone from the compromised networks they had disrupted was now searching for that potential insurance policy. They believed one of the operators had kept copies of the intelligence, and they were systematically working through the team to find it. The harassment and exposure were designed to pressure people into revealing whether they possessed the data. and possibly to eliminate those who might have it but refuse to cooperate. Sarah processed this information with growing unease. If Marcus was right, then everyone from their old unit was in danger until the searchers either found what they wanted or eliminated all potential sources. The disappeared operator might have been taken for interrogation. The one who went dark might possess the data and be protecting it. The rest of them were caught in between, uncertain who had what and who might be targeted next. She asked Marcus the critical question. Did he know who actually had the data? His response was carefully neutral. He had suspicions, but no proof. 3 members of the team had handled the digital storage devices during the extraction. Sarah was one of them. The data still existed. It was likely in the possession of one of those 3 people. The other 2 were the operator who had disappeared and one who had died 2 years ago, in what was officially ruled a car accident but now seemed suspiciously convenient. The implication hung heavy between them. Marcus was asking, without directly asking, if Sarah had kept copies of the intelligence. She met his eyes steadily and told him the truth. She had not. She had followed protocols, turned over everything to the designated handler, and walked away clean. Whether Marcus believed her was unclear, but he nodded and moved on to discussing their options. Those options were limited and grim. They could go to official channels, report the targeting, and request protection, but that would require revealing classified information and might expose them to even more scrutiny from people who might question why they were targets in the first place. They could try to find the intelligence themselves, figure out who actually had it, and either secure it or destroy it. Or they could go on the offensive, identify who was hunting them, and eliminate the threat directly. Sarah knew which option Marcus favored. It was written in his posture, in the careful way he detailed the resources and contacts he still maintained. He wanted to hunt the hunters, use the skills they had spent careers developing to turn the tables on whoever had decided to come after them. It was aggressive and risky, but it would also put them back in control rather than waiting to be the next victim. But Sarah was not the same person who had thrived in that world of preemptive strikes and aggressive tactics. Years trying to leave that behind, building a life where violence was not the first solution to every problem. She asked Marcus to give her time to think, to consider the options before committing to a course of action that would likely end with people dead and questions that could never be fully answered. Marcus agreed. But he also warned her that time was a luxury they might not have. The pace of attacks was accelerating, and the disappeared operator had been gone for over 2 weeks with no communication. Whatever was coming, it was approaching quickly. Sarah would need to decide soon whether she was willing to return to the shadows one more time, whether the peace she had found was worth fighting for, or whether she would let it slip away rather than dirty her hands again with the work she had sworn to leave behind. Sarah spent the night in a motel outside of Reno, paying cash for a room that smelled of cigarettes and industrial cleaner. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by years of training that kept part of her mind alert for threats, even in rest. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would not passively wait for the next attack, but neither would she immediately embrace Marcus's aggressive approach. First, she needed to understand more about who was hunting them and why. She contacted Marcus through a secure channel they had established, requesting information about the operator who had disappeared. His name was David Chen, technical specialist who had indeed been one of the 3 people handling digital storage during their final operation. If anyone from their team had kept copies of the intelligence, Chen would have had both the opportunity and the expertise. His disappearance now seemed less mysterious and more like confirmation of Marcus's theory. Marcus provided an address where Chen had been living, a small apartment in Portland that had been found empty when local police performed a welfare check. No signs of struggle, but also no indication Chen had planned to leave. His car was still in the parking garage, his personal effects still in the apartment, but his computers and external drives were gone. Either he had left in a hurry, taking only his digital assets, or someone had taken him and carefully removed evidence of what they were searching for. Sarah knew she had to see the apartment herself, even though it had already been processed by police. Sometimes the most important evidence was not physical, but contextual. Patterns that only someone who knew the person would recognize. She headed north toward Portland, using the same careful protocols to ensure she remained undetected. The drive gave her time to think about David Chen, to remember his quirks and habits from their years working together. Chen had been meticulous, almost obsessive about backup systems and redundancies. If he had kept copies of the intelligence, he would not have stored them in obvious locations. He would have created layers of security, probably distributed the data across multiple sites and formats. Finding what he had hidden, if anything existed at all, would require thinking like Chen, understanding his psychology and methods. Portland's autumn rain was falling steadily when Sarah arrived, the city gray and wet beneath low clouds. Chen's apartment building was unremarkable, four-story structure in a transitional neighborhood that mixed young professionals with older residents. Sarah had obtained a key through methods she preferred not to examine too closely. Courtesy of Marcus's continued connections in various underground networks, the apartment had the hollow feeling of a space recently occupied but now abandoned. Police tape had been removed, but the sense of official intrusion lingered in the displaced furniture and disturbed belongings. Sarah moved through the room slowly, not searching for obvious evidence, but rather reading the space the way an archaeologist reads ruins. Looking for stories in the arrangement of objects and the patterns of daily life, Chen had lived simply, but not Spartanly. Books lined one wall, technical manuals mixed with science fiction novels. His kitchen showed signs of someone who cooked regularly, quality knives and well-used pans. But it was his office space that told the most interesting story. The desk was positioned to face away from the window, a security measure against visual surveillance. Multiple power strips and cable management systems showed where computers had been arranged. More than one person would typically use for personal computing. Sarah knelt beside the desk, examining the floor and baseboards with careful attention. She found what she was looking for after several minutes of searching. A tiny mark on the wall behind where Chun's main workstation would have sat. To most observers, it would look like a minor scuff or imperfection in the paint, but Sarah recognized it as a deliberate mark, the kind Chen had used during operations to indicate concealed equipment or dead drops. Following the mark's orientation, Sarah checked the section of wall it indicated, running her hands along the baseboard and finding a seam that did not quite match the rest of the molding. Careful pressure revealed a small hidden compartment, professionally installed and nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Inside was a USB drive, small and innocuous. Wrapped in anti-static material, Sarah held the drive carefully, knowing it might contain nothing, or might contain the very intelligence that had put her old team in danger. She could not examine it here, not without equipment and security protocols, but finding it confirmed that Chen had indeed been keeping secrets, had been maintaining operational security measures long after their unit disbanded. The question was whether this drive contained the missing intelligence or something else entirely. A sound from the hallway outside froze Sarah in place. Footsteps, measured and deliberate, approaching Chen's door. She moved silently to a position that gave her view of the entrance, while offering cover and options for escape. Her hand moved to the weapon concealed beneath her jacket, old instincts taking over despite her desire to remain a civilian. The footsteps stopped outside Chen's door. Sarah heard the soft sound of someone testing the handle, finding it locked. Then came the unmistakable click of picks working the mechanism, professional and quick. Whoever was entering was not police or property management. They were someone with skills and purpose. Someone who had likely come looking for the same thing Sarah had just found. The door swung open slowly, revealing a figure in dark clothing who moved with the controlled precision of professional training. Sarah recognized the body language immediately. Former military or intelligence, someone who had spent years in the field. The intruder entered carefully, scanning the room with practiced efficiency, but had not yet spotted Sarah in her concealed position. Sarah made a split-second decision. Rather than confronting the intruder with her weapon, she wanted information first. She stepped out from cover with her hands visible but ready, her voice calm and commanding as she announced her presence. The intruder spun toward her with impressive speed, hand moving toward a concealed weapon, but stopped when he fully registered who he was looking at. Recognition dawned on both their faces simultaneously. The intruder was James Reeves, another member of their old unit, someone Sarah had worked with on half a dozen operations. He was breathing hard, clearly shocked to find her there, his hand still hovering near his weapon but not drawing it. Sarah kept her own hand steady, assessing whether Reeves was friend or threat, whether his presence was coincidence or something more sinister. Reeves spoke first, his voice tight with tension. He asked what Sarah was doing there, how she had known to come to Chen's apartment. The aggressive edge in his questions made Sarah's instincts flare with warning. She countered with her own question, demanding to know why he was breaking into the apartment of a missing teammate. The standoff lasted several long seconds, both of them evaluating the situation and the person they thought they had known years ago. Finally, Reeves lowered his hand from his weapon and moved to close the apartment door behind him. He explained that he had been investigating Chen's disappearance on his own, following leads and trying to understand what had happened. He claimed he was there to look for clues about where Chen might have gone or who might have taken him. But Sarah noticed he kept glancing around the room, his eyes lingering on the places where computers had been, where data might have been stored. Sarah decided to test him. She mentioned that she had been targeted by false intelligence that led to a Coast Guard boarding, and asked if Reeves had experienced anything similar. His reaction told her everything she needed to know. A brief flicker of guilt crossed his face before he controlled his expression, and he took just a fraction too long to answer. When he finally claimed he had not been targeted, Sarah knew he was lying. The conversation shifted to dangerous ground as Reeves asked more pointed questions about what Sarah had found in her search of the apartment. She kept the USB drive concealed, her body positioned to block his view of the compartment where she had discovered it. Instead, she mentioned the missing computers and the police report, watching his reactions carefully. Reeves was hiding something, and his presence here was not the coincidence he wanted her to believe. Sarah's tactical mind was racing through possibilities. Reeves had been on their team but had not been one of the three handling digital storage during the final operation. Yet here he was, breaking into Chen's apartment and asking questions that suggested he knew about the hidden intelligence. That meant either he had always known about it and was searching for it now, or someone had recruited him to find it, possibly through pressure or payment. The tension in the room thickened as both operators circled each other verbally, each trying to extract information without revealing too much. Sarah asked about the other members of their unit, whether Reeves had stayed in contact with anyone. He mentioned a few names casually, but Sarah noticed he did not mention the operator who had disappeared or the one who had died in the suspicious car accident. Those omissions were deliberate, suggesting he knew more than he was admitting. Reeves suddenly changed tactics, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. He told Sarah that they were all in danger, that people with serious resources were hunting their team, and that the only way to stay safe was to find what those people were looking for and use it as leverage. He claimed to have information about who was behind the attacks and what they wanted. But his offer to share that information came with a condition that Sarah find and turn over anything Chen might have hidden. Sarah felt the situation spiraling toward a confrontation. Reeves was not here as a concerned teammate. He was either working with the people hunting them or had his own agenda for finding the intelligence. Either way, he represented a threat that needed to be managed carefully. She began calculating escape routes and tactical options, preparing for the possibility that this conversation would end in violence before either could make another move. A sound from outside the building shattered the tense standoff. Car doors slamming, multiple vehicles arriving simultaneously, the coordinated noise of a team deploying. Both Sarah and Reeves moved to the window, staying to the side to avoid being silhouetted. What they saw in the parking lot below sent ice through Sarah's veins. 6 men were exiting vehicles with the purposeful movement of professionals. They wore civilian clothes, but their formation and equipment marked them as operators, possibly private contractors or foreign intelligence. Most concerning, they were moving directly toward the apartment building entrance with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Someone had been watching Chen's apartment, and now Sarah and Reeves had walked directly into a trap. Sarah and Reeves locked eyes for a brief moment. Their previous tension instantly transformed into tactical partnership by the shared threat below. Years of training and combat experience allowed them to communicate without words. Reeves moved to secure the apartment door while Sarah grabbed her bag and ensured the USB drive was securely concealed. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the team reached this floor. Maybe less if they moved quickly. The apartment building had limited escape options. The main stairwell would put them directly in the path of the approaching team. The fire escape. Outside the window led down to an alley that would be easily covered by anyone coordinating the operation. That left one option that neither operator wanted to take, but both recognized as necessary. They would have to go up to the roof and hope they could reach an adjacent building before the team secured all exits, moving with practiced efficiency. Sarah and Reeves left Chen's apartment and headed for the stairwell leading upward. They could hear voices and footsteps below, the team having entered the building and begun their search. The operators were not trying to be quiet, which suggested they were confident in their numbers and capability. That confidence might work to Sarah's advantage if she and Reeves could stay ahead of the search pattern. The roof access was locked, but Reeves made short work of it with a small tool from his pocket. Cold rain hit them as they emerged onto the flat roof, the weather providing cover, but also making movement treacherous. Sarah scanned the surrounding buildings quickly, identifying a structure to buildings over that was slightly lower and potentially reachable. If they could cross the gaps between buildings, behind them, they heard the roof access door being tested. The team had reached this level faster than expected, either through good tactics or because someone had given them detailed information about the building layout. Sarah and Reeves sprinted toward the edge of the building, no longer worried about stealth, but focused entirely on speed. The first gap between buildings was manageable, perhaps 6 feet across with a drop of 1 story to the roof below. Sarah jumped first, landing in a controlled roll that absorbed the impact and brought her back to her feet. Reeves followed a second. Later, just as voices erupted from the access door they had exited, gunfire cracked through the rain, suppressed weapons that still carried lethal authority. Bullets sparked off metal ventilation units near them, forcing both operators to run in a zigzag pattern that made them harder targets while slowing their escape. The next gap was wider, nearly 10 feet across the void to another building. Sarah knew she could make it, had made similar jumps during training and operations. But the roof surface was slick with rain, and the landing area was cluttered with HVAC equipment that would make a clean landing difficult. She accelerated into the jump anyway, trusting her body to remember decades of physical training. She cleared the gap with room to spare, landing hard but staying on her feet. Behind her, Reeves launched himself across, his trajectory slightly lower than Sarah's. He caught the edge of the building with his hands, body slamming against the wall below the roofline. Sarah grabbed his wrist and hauled him up with strength born of adrenaline and desperation, getting him over the edge just as more gunfire stitched across the space they had just occupied. They were now 2 buildings away from Chen's apartment, but the pursuing team was still coming. Sarah could see them preparing to make the same jumps, their younger bodies and fresh energy giving them advantages in a prolonged chase she needed to change the dynamic, create separation, or eliminate the threat. Continuing to run would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Sarah spotted a door leading into the building they currently occupied and made a decision. She told Reeves they needed to get inside, use the building's interior to create ambush opportunities and bottlenecks. Running across open rooftops made them easy targets. Inside, with corners and doorways and civilian presence to complicate the situation, they could turn the hunters into the hunted. They descended into a building that turned out to be residential. Apartments, older units with narrow hallways and creaking floors. Sarah moved quickly but carefully, aware that innocent people lived here and that bringing violence into their homes was a line she preferred not to cross. But survival sometimes required difficult choices. And right now, survival meant using every advantage the environment offered. Behind them, the pursuing team entered the building with less restraint. Sarah heard doors being kicked open, shouts in accented English that she could not quite place, the sounds of a thorough and aggressive search. These were not people concerned with civilian casualties or local law enforcement. They were professionals with a specific mission, and everything else was secondary to completing that objective. Sarah and Reeves made it to the ground floor and exited through a side entrance into an alley. Rain continued to fall, now a blessing. that reduced visibility and made tracking more difficult. They moved quickly through the urban landscape, using techniques they had learned years ago to break line of sight and create confusion about their direction of travel. Cars, dumpsters, and architectural features became tools for misdirection and concealment. After 15 minutes of evasion tactics, Sarah judged they had created enough separation to pause and regroup. They ducked into a covered parking structure, finding a position behind concrete pillars that offered protection and visibility. Both operators were breathing hard, soaked from rain and exertion, but alert and focused. The immediate threat had been escaped, but both knew this was far from over. Reeves broke the silence first, acknowledging that Sarah had been right about the danger their team faced. The attack at Chen's apartment proved that someone was actively hunting them with professional resources and lethal intent. Whatever disagreements or suspicions existed between Sarah and Reeves, they were now irrelevant compared to the shared threat they faced. Sarah pulled out the USB drive she had found, showing it to Reeves for the first time. His eyes widened slightly, confirming he knew what it might contain. She told him directly that she did not know if this drive held the intelligence everyone was searching for, but someone clearly thought it might. The question now was what to do with it, whether to examine its contents or destroy it immediately to eliminate the reason they were being hunted. Reeves argued for examining the drive, claimed that understanding what was on it would give them leverage, allow them to negotiate, or at least know what they were protecting. But Sarah was not convinced. Opening the drive might activate tracking software or reveal information that made them even larger targets. Sometimes the best move was to eliminate the objective entirely, make what everyone was searching for permanently unavailable. Their debate was interrupted by the sound of sirens approaching. Someone had called police about the gunfight on the rooftops and the aggressive search through the residential building. Local authorities would complicate everything, requiring explanations neither Sarah nor Reeves could provide without exposing classified information and triggering even more official scrutiny. Sarah made a command decision. They would separate, make themselves harder to track and engage. She would take the USB drive and head back to meet with Marcus, who had resources to examine it safely. Reeves would create a diversion, use his presence to draw attention, while Sarah slipped away. It was not a perfect plan, but perfection was rarely achievable in crisis situations. Reeves hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with letting the drive out of his sight. But he also recognized the tactical sense in Sarah's plan. One person could move more quietly than two, and splitting up would force any pursuers to make choices about who to follow. He agreed with one condition: that Sarah contact him once she knew what was on the drive. Whatever it contained, their old team deserved to know what they were dying for. They parted ways in the parking structure, two operators heading in different directions with the weight of old missions and new threats bearing down on them. Sarah moved through Portland's streets with the drive burning like a coal in her pocket. A small piece of technology that apparently held the power to destroy lives and topple networks. She had thought her war was over when she retired, that the ocean would wash away the blood and choices of her past. Now she knew that some wars never truly end. They just wait in the shadows, patient and hungry, for the moment when old soldiers think they have finally found peace.